Hello and welcome to episode 69 of the Page One podcast. I'm Tarek.
I'm Marco, and thanks for joining us at the Page One podcast again, where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, how they got into the industry, and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. We've spoken to authors, script writers, comics writers, video game writers, comedians, journalists, and any other kind of writer is always welcome on the show. So do check out the back catalogue. There's a lot of good names there. But we do have another great guest this week.
We have an excellent guest this week on the 69th episode, Marco. And I know Marco made me promise that I wouldn't say anything, but it's hard not to when it's
good. Let's keep going. Keep it going. Keep it going.
Episode 69 means, Marco.
It's more one episode till
70.
Exactly. Yes.
But anyway, this week, D.V. Bishop is on this week, who is an author of City of Vengeance, which we chat to him about. It's a historical thriller. He's also very big in Judge Dredd world, which is something Mark was very excited about.
Yeah, he was formerly editor of Judge Dredd The Megazine when it started, and then 2000 AD as well for a bit in the 90s. So he's and it was really interesting speaking to him about that and how he got into it, because he was a journalist who then just applied for a job basically and suddenly became the editor of Judge Dredd The Megazine, which was quite these comics were pretty big in the 90s. They're still big now, but that was when it was really exactly. Yeah. And it was interesting hearing about what his role was as the editor, as opposed to sort of writing stories, and then moving on to writing his own fiction as well. So he's written comics, which we chat to him about, but he was working on City of Vengeance, which is set in 1536, I think, in Florence, for over 20 years, I think he said.
Yeah, it's been a novel a long time in the making.
Mm-hmm.
And he won the competition at the Bloody Scotland Crime Festival. He got the Robert Louis Stevenson Fellowship Award while he was writing it. So it's had a lot of buzz, the whole way along. So it's exciting to finally see the final book in his hands, I think.
It is, and it's an interesting historical novel as well, because it's obviously historical, and it's, as we speak to him, he was very keen to keep it true to the historical facts. But at the same time, it's got a very modern structure and pacing, I think, and the way the characters speak to each other, I think, is quite modern, which I like in a historical novel. It's not ye olde English
totally,
or ye olde Italian.
It's something that I think Robert Harris does well in his historical books, which is you feel like you're learning about stuff, but you don't feel like it's an old, isn't read like an old book. It reads like a modern book, even though it's set old times. And it's for me, that's the way I like to read historical fiction.
Yeah, definitely. So it's a really interesting chat with David. So we'll get straight into it after a quick advert for our notebook, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest.
But for now, on with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realise it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project. divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page 1.
I always start these podcasts by asking our guests if they always wanted to be a writer, but I know that you've had a very varied and quite a long career involved in writing in some aspect for a long time. So how did that all begin?
Oh, just like an awful lot of writers, I was a voracious reader as a boy. I grew up in New Zealand, and I just read everything I could get my hands on. So, sort of, I can't really remember what I started reading, but whatever it was, the usual things, sort of, Famous Five and mysteries, and then moving on from there, and
Yep.
Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and anything I could lay my hands on, comic books. And my dad was he was a big fan of Reader's Digest condensed books,
Right.
which you don't really see in the UK, but which was a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a way of, they would have long novels, and they would do like the 200-page version of the novel with any swear words and any sex taken out. I discovered years later.
I always wondered how those work. But how do they choose what to cut out and how to slim it down? Is it literally just take out the sex and the violence, and it should be pretty much?
No, it's abridgment is its own peculiar skill set. I run a program, a creative writing program, the Masters at Edinburgh Napier University. We actually used to teach a class on abridgment and how you do it.
All right.
It's a slightly dying field at the moment. You don't tend to see a lot of abridgment publications anymore. So we decided, well, there wasn't a lot of work going, so there was no point teaching it as a skill. But it's a very peculiar skill, to be the ability to dramatically cut out huge chunks of a story while keeping the essence and the tone and style of it alive. For Reader's Digest, they also removed, sort of the swearing and the sex as well. I only discovered this decades later when I was on holiday, Morocco, I think it was, with no money. And the hotel had a sort of left behind library of the books that nobody wanted to put in their suitcase. So I ended up reading The Thornbirds, which I'd read as a Reader's Digest condensed book decades earlier. And I went, my God, there's a lot of shagging in this. I don't remember any. When were all these priests having sex? I don't remember any of this. So there you go. That was a slight shock to the system. But yeah, I can understand why my dad was perfectly happy for me to be reading the entirety of the Reader's Digest condensed book library at the age of 9, 10, 11, because he knew I wasn't getting too much of the source. So.
And from there, when did that obviously sparked the desire to start writing your own stories? Did it?
Yeah, I've always had a bit of a wild imagination, and I started. I think the first story I can remember writing was like Famous Five fanfic, effectively, which mostly seemed to, and this is like at the age of 7 or 8, mostly seemed to involve being tied up in caves. Slightly worrying as a tendency, but nonetheless, it's the mystery element and sort of the threat and the jeopardy just very much appealed to me.
Yep.
And then I've long been a Doctor Who fan, so the level of jeopardy in Doctor Who has sort of stuck with me. So the other thing I read voraciously growing up was the Doctor Who novelizations, the Target books, where they adapted Doctor Who stories into relatively easy to read versions. And particularly growing up in New Zealand, where we didn't see vast chunks of Doctor Who, so you only had the books to go on. So it was always a disappointment when you actually got to watch the real stories on VHS years later and discovered that's nowhere near as good as my imagination.
Yeah.
Wow, those sets really are rubbish. So I started writing my own stories and inventing my own stories, and building little books all of my own and trying to convince people to read them. And so it's been a lifelong passion of reading and writing, and so it's inevitably led in that direction. So after school, I trained as a journalist because it sort of met my skill set of being both a blabbermouth and liking to write. And so that was, I was a journalist for 5 years in New Zealand, and then immigrated to the UK, and became a comics editor very quickly after that. So, yeah.
And yeah, so on that path, I mean, how did that happen? From being a journalist, how did you become a comics editor in the UK? What it's a sort of opportunity. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the reality is comics editorial for the most part, certainly through the 70s and the 80s. I mean, I joined it in the 90s, but there was a tradition of sort of trained journalism. Was how people went into comics, particularly for people who only aspired to be editors as opposed to editors who really wanted to be writers, which became the way of things in comics through the 90s. Basically, people went into editorial as a stepping stone into getting to write their own comics.
And what exactly is when you say you're like an editor of a comic? How is that different than being like a writer on the comic? What's your role in that?
Oh gosh. Well, many things. You commission the writers to write the scripts. You commission the artists to draw the scripts. If there's colorists, you need to commission them. Letterers as well. You need to work with the writers to get the scripts as good as they could possibly be in the time and budget you have available. Then you have to find the best artists you can in the time and budget you have available, and get them to draw it. And then all the other production processes involved in it. There's a lot of sub-editing, making sure it's fit for publication, fits the space available, is as good as it can possibly be, managing the budgets, all the other things involved in an editorial capacity, really. And frequently, I mean, when I edited a title called the Judge Dredd Megazine for 5 years, and then I moved on to 2000 AD, which for anybody who doesn't know is basically sort of the mothership of British comics. And where anybody who has worked in comics, certainly up until the last 5 or 10 years, and went on to work in other like American comics, went through the charm school of 2000 AD and sort of cut their teeth there. Yeah. So you, at any given moment when I was editing 2000 AD, I had had 60 or 70 freelance creatives, writers, artists, colorists, letterers, all around the world working for me and having to manage all of their schedules, so that each week a new 32-page comic was released into the wild to our readers, and keep hold of the budget and expenditure and all the other things involved. So it was basically a two-person machine required. We commissioned 1,600 pages of new story and art every year for publication. And every year the budget was cut by another 5 to 10%. So it was a bit of a challenge at times.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So I got into that. When I immigrated to the UK, I had skills as a journalist. I had a little bit of training as a sub-editor, and I met a man called John Freeman, who was the editor of Doctor Who magazine at the time, and ended up being my flatmate. And I went to see him for a job. He said, "Oh, there's no job here," which was slightly disappointing because that's where my hopes were pinned. But he said, just get the Guardian newspaper on a Monday. In those days, there were jobs advertised in the Guardian on a Monday, and just apply for every job you see. So I ended up working at a TV listings magazine, sort of like the Radio Times, but for one of the satellite channels. And then I saw a job advertised to become an assistant editor at Fleetway, who were the publishers of 2000 AD, and they were launching new titles at the start of the 90s. And so I ended up working on the Judge Dredd magazine when it was launched in September 1990. And so I worked with a man called Steve McManus, who had been editing comics for the better part of 20 years by that point, and learnt my craft from him. It was like an apprenticeship, learn how to be a good comics editor and help your creators create the best possible material. And most of that actually is employ good people and get out of their way. Is the best thing that a comics editor can do is be invisible, really. It's like the music in a film. If you notice it, then they've sort of intruded too much into the process. It should be like great lettering in comics should be invisible. You shouldn't even notice it's there.
Mhm.
It should be so seamless that you're absorbed into the story, the narrative, and the artwork. You don't notice lettering, and so you shouldn't notice an editor. An editor should be somebody who's behind the scenes, who facilitates. Like a book editor is to a large extent mostly invisible.
Yeah, and when you were there as well, you did then start writing some stories for it as well. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I started. I mean, I always had ambitions to write. It was one of the reasons why I wanted to move out of journalism into a more creative field. Was sort of 5 years as a daily newspaper journalist. I was tired of writing other people's stories and going around and finding out other people doing things and then reporting on it. I was like,
Yeah.
that's fine, but I wanted to be telling stories of my own. And so going into comics was great because it was a creative outlet. I could, one of the things I really enjoyed was finding new writers and artists and helping them build their careers and learn their craft. And I was learning alongside them at the same time, making plenty of mistakes along the way. So I wanted to, Steve McManus, who was my mentor, he always said, the thing he regretted most was that he started writing when he started an editorial, but he didn't keep it up. He sort of got sucked into just the editorial job, and it consumed all time and space, because comics editing can be like that, because it's a full-time job, and you give it the office and there's nothing left when you get home. So I was determined to try and keep writing. So I wrote some not very good comics at the start of my comics career. And then the Judge Dredd film was coming in the mid-90s, the one starring Sylvester Stallone. Virgin Books got a license to publish original novels set in the Judge Dredd universe, and they didn't have anybody who could possibly write it, because most of the people who were writing Doctor Who and other things for Virgin Books, the fiction department at the time, had no knowledge or experience of Judge Dredd, and the learning curve involved in an intellectual property, an IP like that, is pretty steep.
Yeah,
it's easier if you can get people who actually know the IP to come in and do the work, rather than try and get people who can write to learn the IP, because it's a big ask. I mean, I wrote a couple of Warhammer novels for the Games Workshop imprint, Black Library, and I think the readers could probably tell that I was not wedded in the ways of Warhammer, and I was basically writing my own book with sort of like Warhammer stuck on the cover. It's kind of what it boiled down to. In fact, my editor kept telling me off, saying, "Stop calling it a police procedural. It's a Warhammer novel." Whereas I just wanted to be writing crime fiction, and but that's where the jobs were, so I went where the work was.
When you're writing a novel like that, like a franchise type novel, what restrictions are placed on you by? I
mean, it varies wildly from franchise to franchise, from IP to IP. So I've written Judge Dredd, I've written Doctor Who, I've written what else? The Warhammers. I did a load of other 2000 AD characters, Nikolai Dante, Fiends of the Eastern Front. I did a Nightmare on Elm Street novel at one point. And a lot of those, I mean, it varies completely depending upon how controlling or not they are. So I did my first Doctor Who novel was called Who Killed Kennedy, which came out, 25 years ago this year, which is terrifying. And at that point in history, Doctor Who, it had been off TV for 6 years. It was about to come back fleetingly with Paul McGann. But it got to the point where it wasn't on telly. The BBC wasn't paying much attention. You could get away with an awful lot. In fact, Ben Aronovich, who does the Rivers of London series, wrote some pretty notorious sequences in some of his Doctor Who original novels. I think Transit in particular has got some saucy moments, which you wouldn't get away with now. And then there are other times when I was writing. I remember when Doctor Who came back on TV in the mid-noughties, and I was writing Doctor Who audio dramas at that point and other things, and suddenly the restrictions became, the attention being paid to the IP by BBC was a lot more stringent, and there was a lot of things that you absolutely couldn't do in the tie-ins. Like, you couldn't mention God or the devil or Satan. You couldn't have magic as such. Even though, on TV they had an episode called The Satan Pit, but you couldn't do it in the books.
That's
You do it on
bizarre.
telly, that's
What's
fine.
the reason behind all that stuff? Is there
Because they don't want to offend people, and they certainly
Right.
don't want to offend like the Daily Mail or the Express or the Telegraph. So it's, it's if something's on the BBC, it's deemed to be like national property because it's funded by the license fee. So therefore, anybody can complain about anything on the BBC, and the BBC sort of has to snap to attention and respond to their complaints. So there's a lot of being very careful, essentially, and saying, particularly, because Doctor Who was deemed as being like sort of this, both like a crossover property, both suitable for children of 7, 8, 9, 10, but also for adults. So when Doctor Who was off TV for a long time, then the books essentially became a niche market for people who used to watch it on TV and who were well into their 20s and 30s and older. So it didn't matter. You could have, saucy Ben Aronovich being saucy, and nobody would notice. Whereas when suddenly it's back on TV and the giant magnifying glass of, daily coverage of it because it became a hit show again, suddenly everybody's paying attention to everything. So the BBC had to be a lot more quiet. When I did Nightmare on Elm Street, I remember I wrote my pitch for the novel, and it went off to New Line Cinema in LA, and I waited 6 months and heard nothing back, and they just came back and said, yeah, that's fine. I was like, okay. And then I just wrote the book, and it went away, and it came back, and they said, yeah, that's fine. Because I'd grown up watching Elm Street films, so I knew my Freddy. I was not trying to reinvent the wheel. I was just trying to tell, the best possible Freddy Krueger story I could. So I wasn't, with tie-ins, you have to think of it as like a rental car. It's like you have rented your all-time favorite car that you've always wanted, hopefully, to take out for a drive. But you have to bring it back intact and unscratched. Otherwise, you lose your deposit. Well, it's the same with tie-ins. You can take it out for a test drive. You can take the TARDIS for a test drive across time and space, but you've got to bring it back in the condition you took it out in. So you don't get to like kill companions, generally speaking, or you don't get to have the Doctor suddenly pick up a machine gun and murder a load of children, because strangely enough, he doesn't do that. So you have to be true to the tone and spirit and style of the IP that you're working with, but you still have to tell an entertaining, exciting, interesting story. And ideally what you want to do is tell a story they couldn't easily tell on TV or whatever it is, the medium that it's been transposed from. So you want to add value to it at the same time.
And the whole time you were working in the tie-in market, you were working on 2000 AD, etc. You were obviously, because I'm sure I read that your new novel, which we will chat about shortly, City of Vengeance, that was an idea that was kind of 20 years in the making or so. So, I'm presuming the whole time you've got this idea that you kind of want to write your own fiction, and all this stuff must have been really helpful to you when it came to making that step into doing your own writing. I'm assuming just all this exposure and this surrounding yourself with all this different types of fiction writing and each side of the coin, etc.
Absolutely yes, is the short answer. Every kind of, writing is a muscle. So if you are writing, you are exercising the muscle, and particularly when you're creating narrative, creating story, it's all useful. There'll be a lot of work that you create along the way in a career that may not necessarily find the audience you're hoping for, or any audience at all. I spent, the better part of 8-9 years doing screenwriting, and I had some success during that time, which was great. I wrote 4 episodes of a BBC TV drama series called Doctors, which is on during the day, and I wrote for a CBeebies show as well. But equally, there came a point in my screenwriting career where I spent, I think, 3 years, and I was writing things and I was pouring my heart and soul into it. And the problem with screenwriting, if it doesn't get commissioned, then all of that work would just go straight into the bin, effectively. Yeah. So I spent 2 or 3 years writing material that was read by 3 people, maybe, including myself. And that it breaks your heart as a writer. I suspect I'm always going to be a prose writer at heart, and you write to be read. There's reasons why we all write. Okay, you write because for the love of writing as a process in and of itself, which is not to say that it's lovely the whole time. Sometimes it's pulling teeth and all the other things that we talk about. And you write because you've got a compulsion to write. You've got stories you want to get out into the world, stories you want to share with other people, ideas and things that are bubbling in your imagination that you need to put down on the page or a screen, and you want other people to enjoy or appreciate or gain something from the experience of your narrative that you've invented. So that's sort of the essence of writing, why we do it. And there are other reasons. I mean, yeah, we would like to be paid for our labor. Thank you very much. And we would like a little bit of validation every now and then. Goes a long way with a writer. Say good work and they'll beam and smile, and some of them will be self-deprecating. I mean, I'm terrible at taking a compliment. And other people will absolutely lap it up. So a little validation is helpful. Some people think that you can write and become famous and glamorous, which is not my experience. There are famous writers, but they tend to be absolutely the exception. And I'm not sure the amount of scrutiny that comes with fame these days is quite worth the price of admission. So you would like your work to be seen by as many people as possible and enjoyed by as many people as possible, or at least appreciated by as many people as possible. And if that brings financial rewards, then that's helpful because it enables you to do more work. So writing helps you on the journey, and I do believe that you learn from every piece of work that you do. Sometimes the lessons aren't evident necessarily for quite a long time, and sometimes what you learn is don't do that again, and that's a perfectly valid lesson as well. I mean, I've tried different methodologies, approaches to writing. So for City of Vengeance, for that one, it was very much following the timetable of history, and then I structured my story around that. Whereas I've just literally within about 48 hours of finishing the next book in the series, which currently doesn't have a title. And for that one, I've deliberately written, it's a kind of locked room mystery set in a convent in Renaissance Florence. And for that, I deliberately did not want to know who done it while I was writing it. I held back as long as humanly possible before saying, this is the person that did the bad thing. But that made my life a whole lot harder, I have to say. There's a lot of crime writers who absolutely say you shouldn't know who the killer is as you're writing the book. You get to the end, you discover who it is, and then you go back and do rewrites to set that up. You get to the end, you go, oh, it's this person. Oh, okay, right. And then you go back and layer in the clues that lead towards that person, so it's possible for the reader to have figured it out. I found that challenging.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I suspect partly because I've done so much work with tie-ins and IP, and in order to get that work, generally speaking, you have to do a complete chapter breakdown for the entire narrative of what's going to happen before you can get the gig,
right?
Before you get contracted and before you get your signature fee, and then you go away and draft the book. So up to this point, I've been very much a hardcore plotter, total planner, have it all laid out, which then enabled me to write very quickly when I was drafting, because basically it's like add description and dialogue and on you go. Make it as good as you can. But you've done a lot of the carpentry. The architecture has already been done. You just need to come in and lay the carpets.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the full hardcore plotter version of it. So the novel I'm just in the process of finishing, I have been a lot more at the pantsing end of the spectrum, where you are, journey of discovery, write stuff and find out things as you go along and see where that leads you. And that's quite the high wire act. And it made me very grateful for the fact that I've got sort of a 20, 30-year career in different kinds of writing, because it meant I knew I had the confidence of all of that experience and all of that learning about structure and setups and payoffs and characterization and all these other things that enabled me that when I was having the long, dark tea time of the soul and you're freaking out and you're not sure where you're going with the book, you can step back and go, you can do this. You've done this before. Because it's amazing the healing power of you've done this before, therefore you can do it again. Whereas when you're writing your first novel, you honestly have no idea if you can get to the finish. Like doing your first marathon, I guess.
And when you're, I mean, it's funny because for particularly for crime, as you say, some crime writers do say that, don't know who's done it until I've finished the story. But yeah, the idea of a structure, the thing about crime novels especially is that there normally is a structure, as you say, behind them. So to sort of pants a novel like that, as they say, rather than plot it in detail, seems to be a very, very difficult thing to do.
Yeah. I mean, any kind of pants-led approach, is that a phrase? Anyway, anybody who decides they're going to write a novel and they're going to pants it, if they don't have experience under their belt, if you're going to pants a novel and it's your first novel, I mean, to me, that's asking for a world of pain.
Mm-hmm.
If only for the fact that you don't have a structure to help you out as you're going along on the journey. You are literally, basically, it ends up your first draft becomes somebody else's pre-writing, somebody else's advanced plotting and structuring.
Yeah.
And it means that if you go for the full pants approach, again, not really a good phrase, but if you're going for the full pants approach, it means that your first draft effectively is your zero draft. And then you discover your story and your characters and your world because you build it as you go along. Hopefully you make it to the finish line. And then you have to go back to the start and go, oh, right, okay, now I know what my book is about. Now I know my world and my characters and I know my story. Now I can write the proper version of it. So the sort of the plotter version enables you to write, in my view, fewer drafts and fewer rewrites as a consequence.
Yeah.
But of course, if you've got all the experience in the world, if you're Stephen King, then you kind of know, the rhythm of a book, what needs to happen now. You have a sense of, this has been, dragging its heels. Let's, something needs to happen now. There needs to be threat. There needs to be jeopardy. There needs to be a turning point. So yeah, if you're Ian Rankin or you're Val McDermid or whoever else it might be, then that sort of stuff is almost baked into your DNA as a writer because you've done it so much, you know what needs to happen. You have a sense of when, if it's boring to you as a writer, God knows it's going to be boring to the reader on the page. So you can make a note to yourself and say, well, when I come back and fix this needs to go faster, or this needs to happen more, or other things need to occur here because this is dragging. And that comes from experience, is where that comes from.
But do you have, obviously that's the approach you've taken for the latest novel, but do you have a preference, or does it just depend on the story you're wanting to tell? Like, would you go back to doing a sort of full treatment almost for another story that you were going to tell?
I mean, I think, well, for the next one, which I'm planning, the identity of who the killer is, I've already got a good sense of them. I don't have a name or anything yet. But I mean, I know where it's going. And the nature of the third story, it's about retribution, and it's going to be, so it's, the nature of the third one will lend itself to a more plotted and planned version. Also, if it goes ahead, it'll be a home and away fixture. One of the detectives is going to still be in Florence, and the other one is going to be outside the city, sort of up in the hills where the rich people used to retreat to their summer homes during the heat of summer. So it'll be a home and away fixture. So it will need some careful choreography. So I will be doing more planning for book 3 of the Cesare Aldo series, definitely. If only because book 2's taken me longer to write than it would have done. I mean, I don't think the lockdown has helped, if I'm honest, because I run I'm program leader for MA Creative Writing at Edinburgh Napier University, and the lockdown meant I think the lockdown hit about a month after I started writing book 2. And that threw everything out the window. We had to switch to online teaching. We had to reconfigure the entire program for the new academic year in September. So that has eaten up an awful lot of my time and energy, unfortunately. So it's meant this book has taken longer than I would have expected. But equally, I think if I had planned a bit further ahead and a bit more so, I think I would have found it an easier write. So that tells me something about my practice and my approach to it as a writer. I definitely think next time I'm going to plan and plot a bit more than I did for this one. I mean, this one's a locked room mystery. And the great thing about crime is that to a large extent, the structure is given to you by the narrative engine that you've chosen, which is the genre. There will be a crime, there will be an investigation, they will or won't find the solution, they will or won't find who did it, and they will or will not bring that person to justice. So that kind of gives you your overarching structure automatically, and it's in when do we get in, when do we get out, where is it set. But then it's the big saggy middle, which is the doom of, you know, any writer. Really. It's that, you know, anybody, I think most people who believe they have a book in them, what they actually have in them is, if it's a novel, is they have act one. You know, they have the setting, they have some characters, they have something incredible that happens that blows the world out of balance. The character reacts to it. They try to put the pieces of their life back together. It doesn't work. That's the end of act one of almost any story with a sort of traditional protagonist on a journey of change. So that's fine. Now, if they're lucky, they know how the book ends. They know, you know, because act one, this is the thing I teach. I teach a whole module on pre-writing. So which is based on a lot of screenwriting theory, in fact. But the idea is that inciting incident, that thing that throws the world out of balance, asks a dramatic question, whatever that may be. Somebody's dead. Who done it? Why done it? How done it? Is the crime trinity of what's going to happen. And then, so that inciting incident asks a dramatic question, and generally speaking, that dramatic question is answered towards the end of your narrative by what's sometimes called the obligatory scene, which is where we get to the answer, where we have the final confrontation between whomever it is. So that's fine. You have anybody who says they have a novel in them has act one. If they're lucky, they have the ending, act 3, act 5, whatever it is. But it's the big middle is where the problems always come, and where people who start with enthusiasm usually run out of gas. Somewhere around 30,000 words.
Yeah, and even like well-established authors that we've had on always say the same thing. Actually, you know, they hit that bit in the middle of the book that where they start questioning themselves, even if they've got, you know, a run of successful books before. It doesn't seem to go away for most people either.
Yeah, no, because I mean, I think pretty much all writers I know and I've met, and I've gone to a lot of panels and listened to a lot of podcasts, and I have to agree with what people say, which is that writers always want the next book to be just that little bit better than the last one. You always aspire to improve and to, you know, to build on what you've learned and what you've achieved and try and take it up another notch. That's the goal. You don't always manage it. And, you know, the ups and downs of careers and the business of publishing, that's a whole other discussion. But you're always striving to try and do the next book to be better and slightly more so than the last one. So that means you're always raising the bar for yourself. So what was good enough last time isn't good enough next time. Also, you really only know how to write a book when you've just finished it, which is so annoying. Because you go, oh, that's how I write it. You say at the end of however many thousand words were required to get you to the end. And then you can go back and fix it, which is grand because you've got the roadmap now. But you so wish that at the start of a book, you were like, I know exactly how to write this book. And generally the few occasions when I've started a book saying, I know exactly how to write this book, hubris has been waiting to kick my ass somewhere down the road. So yeah.
Yeah, why don't you tell us, we've mentioned it a lot, but why don't you tell us about City of Vengeance and what that's about?
Cool. Okay. So City of Vengeance is a historical crime thriller. It's set in Renaissance Florence in the winter of 1536, which is sort of around the last days of Henry VIII, if you want a Tudor comparison, effectively. So it's sort of the back end of the Renaissance. You know, Leonardo da Vinci is gone. I think Michelangelo is in exile by this point. Machiavelli has just died. So sort of the greats of the Renaissance have left Florence for one reason or another, but the city endures. And my central character is he's an officer of the most feared criminal court in Renaissance Florence, which is called the Otto, for short, the Otto de Italia. And he's an officer of the court, so he enforces the law and he also investigates crimes. And he, in the course of the book, he has to investigate the murder of a Jewish moneylender. And in the process of that investigation, he uncovers a conspiracy to overthrow Duke Alessandro de' Medici, who was the ruler and leader of Florence at this point in history. And Aldo's problem, so his name is Cesare Aldo, and Aldo's problem is he's only got a few days to try and stop this conspiracy from overthrowing the Duke. But at the same time, Aldo is a gay man at a time and place in history where his sexuality makes him a criminal. So he's an officer of the court, but he's on the wrong side of the law. And there's a rival officer within the court who wants to bring Aldo down, who wants to destroy him. So the challenge for Aldo is, can he stop the conspiracy to overthrow the Duke and throw the city into chaos before Aldo's own secrets destroy him?
Yeah. Nice. It sounds absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I've not finished it yet, but I have started reading it. And one thing that struck me was that it's written, although it's a historic, it's set in 1536, as you say, it's very modern in its approach, you know, and the pacing and the structure and things like that, which totally pulls you right into the story, I think. I mean, was that a deliberate decision to sort of bring that into a sort of historical novel?
Yeah, I mean, it was a decision, but B, it's a factor of the way I write. Mm-hmm. I suspect because I trained as a journalist, it may even go back to the fact I just read a load of Terrance Dick's Doctor Who novelizations growing up, but that sort of lean, pared back style, and then becoming a journalist where everything has to be lean and pared back. And then having worked in comics I've written comics for 30 years. I was a comics editor for the best part of 12 years, where again, it's about concision, clarity of communication, and then a big focus on characterization. Mm-hmm. So all of that means that the nature of my writing is I can't help myself. I write pace. I just write pace. In fact, the big note I got from Alex Saunders, my wonderful editor at Pan Macmillan, was, you know, he said, like, the pace of your book, of the draft of City of Vengeance, is incredible, and you can take your foot off the gas every now and then. Just give us moments to breathe. And I was like, yeah, I know. Sorry, I just tend to write pedal to the metal very much. It's the way I'm built. So I have to step off the gas. I have to sort of step back and go, okay, I need to remember to give moments for characters to breathe and react and respond, and to give the readers a chance to catch their breath in between all the things that are going on. And because the City of Vengeance, it's this sort of ticking clock of the conspiracy is going to happen on this date. Aldo's only given 4 days to solve the murder of the Jewish moneylender. So there's always this ticking clock. There's always the sense of history is bearing down on the characters. But is the challenge with historical fiction is that you have to remember characters don't know what's going to happen next. Just like we don't know what's, you know, if we went back 10 months in time and it was March and we were going, oh, this pandemic looks a bit dodgy, we would have no sense of where this was leading, or the terrible loss of lives that was ahead of us, because people don't know what's going to happen in history. They only know what happened yesterday. They don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. They may have a glimpse of it. They may have a thought of what they're going to do tomorrow, but you never know what's around the corner. So you have to remember that for your characters. But yeah, so sort of my challenge with City of Vengeance was finding that balance between my natural super pacey page turning style and yet respecting the fact that readers of historical fiction, they love atmosphere. They love that sort of world building, not in a fantasy sense, but making it feel like you are walking the streets alongside these characters. So it feels like you're looking around and you're seeing you see the terracotta tiles catching the sun glowing orange at the late afternoon of the Duomo in Florence, or you're having to step over the channel in the middle of the mud streets where the human waste runs down the middle of the street. Almost every review I've read of City of Vengeance mentions how pungent the book is for the level of aromas that gets mentioned in it. Which is, I hadn't realized I'd gone quite so smelly with the book until people started telling me how richly atmospheric it was. But yeah, it's strange. It's the number of books you read that never mention how things smell is surprising. You know, people will describe how things look or how it feels, but a lot of writers don't really engage all five senses. And if you can just pick one or two smells that are very evocative, and then mention them in the books, then it gets into the nostrils, it gets into the imaginations of your readers. So yeah, I'm sorry, but the next book is equally whiffy.
And when you're writing historical fiction, you mentioned that you kind of got the structure a bit from historical events, I think. But I mean, how important do you think it is to stick to history accurately, in so much as history is accurate, I suppose, because different historians will tell you different things. But but how important is that, or is it okay in your view to change things, merge characters and all this sort of stuff, as long as the story's good and you're getting the sense of the time?
I mean, that's one of those questions that you have to make a choice as a writer, is where you sit on the, I am going to be absolutely truthful to history and inform my story around events, or I can do what I like, if history's helpful, that's fine. I mean, I tended to go at the Hilary Mantel end of the spectrum. She says it's not your job as a writer to fix history. It's your job to work with what's available to you. And the reality is, if you're writing historical fiction, there are gaps in the narrative. Also, the version of history that we are getting is partial.
Yeah.
A lot of documents don't survive history. And also a lot of the people who were alive at that time were not literate, did not read and write, were not able to share or leave their story behind. So therefore, there's a lot of absences and gaps. History is predominantly written by men who are educated, of wealth or in positions of power. So that means there are vast sections of society that are omitted from the record, who are not represented. So you have to think about, well, how to tell that story. And equally, you have to go, there's some things, I think I put an author's note at the back of, a historical note at the back of City of Vengeance. And I talk about the fact there's a vital plot incident in the book where historians do not agree on what date it occurred, whether it was Friday, the 5th of January, 1536, or whether it was Saturday, the 6th of January, 1536. And I got to a point where I was writing the book and plotting forwards in the book. And I went to my enormous bulging Billy bookcase behind me, which is double stacked with reference tomes. And I went through all of them trying to find a definitive answer. And in the end, I think it was like 70% said it was Saturday night, 30% of historians said it was Friday night. And I was like, oh, right, Saturday it is. And that's what we're going with. But there were things that I discovered when I was writing the book that were hugely inconvenient for my storytelling. And I was like, oh, history, you bastard. But I just went, okay, well, I've set out my stall. I'm going to let history be my timetable. And if I discover something, no matter how bloody ass awkward it might be, I am going to be truthful to whatever history I can find and point to and say, this is what happened, and I will attempt to form my story around that. So that's what I did. There were times it was a bit of a nightmare. And also there were times where I would discover things when I was 60,000 words into the book, and I would go, oh, okay, right, well, I'm going to have to go back and fix that then, aren't I? So, for instance, because there's the Jewish community in Florence at the time was only about 100 people. There was only about 100 Jews living in Florence in this period of history during the Renaissance. But they were quite important because their ability to do money lending, which was forbidden by the Catholic Church, which was the church at the time in Italy, certainly, and certainly in Florence. So they served a valuable role and purpose within Florentine merchant society, which was basically how Florence was run by bankers and merchants. It wasn't a church town, unlike places like Bologna or Rome. So therefore, when I was writing the Jewish community, I was doing research into it. But it was like I discovered at some point when I was writing the story, there weren't enough people to have a synagogue. They didn't have a synagogue. I went, okay, fine. And then I discovered there weren't enough people to have a rabbi. They just had to get on with, doing their worship in whatever way they could. Bearing in mind, there weren't enough people to have a rabbi in the city. So they had to find other ways of doing worship. So that meant rewriting one whole character was going to be a rabbi. And I was like, except they didn't have a rabbi. Fine. So yeah, there would be things I would discover that would be immensely awkward, but I was like, I was committed to being as truthful to history as I possibly could. So that's what I strove to do as best as I can. I'm sure there are mistakes and errors in the book, despite my best efforts, but I tried.
And when you start off, I was kind of interested to know when you're beginning and you're saying, I want to write a historical fiction, detective story. What end do you start with first? Do you have the kind of story that you want to tell, or do you do research into the whole area and just find a pocket of history that fits, or do you just read history and let the story kind of form from what you're reading?
I mean, in my case, the starting point for all of this was I found an academic monograph about criminal justice and I think it's on my shelf. Criminal justice and crime in late Renaissance Florence, 1537 to 1609. And so I was in a remaindered bookshop around the corner from the British Museum. I think this is at the end of the 1990s, for goodness sakes. And I opened this book up purely by chance because I've always wanted to go to Florence at that point, but I hadn't been. And there was one sentence in this book that I just opened by chance, this page, and it said, the criminal justice system in Renaissance Florence in this period was roughly comparable to a modern police force. And I just went, ding, light bulb. Mm-hmm. And I went, fine, okay, good. Because I love police procedurals and I love crime narratives. And even when I was writing for Doctors on BBC One, or Judge Dredd, who's a future policeman anyway, or even when I was writing my Warhammer novels and I was basically just writing Hill Street Blues with the occasional elf wandering past in the background. I really wanted to be writing crime fiction. It just took me a long time to come out and admit it. This book just sort of gave me permission to think of it in those ways, to think, okay, well, it was roughly comparable to a modern police force. So one of the things I read in this particular monograph, it talked about the fact that they could have what was called extrajudicial justice, which meant if somebody was deemed to be guilty, they could go into the cell, and as long as there was a priest present in order to give this person the last rites, they could just, throttle him in the cells, really, if they decided he was guilty. And that was that.
There's a bit of Judge Dredd there as well.
Yeah, well, it really was judge, jury, and executioner. Yeah. I mean, weirdly, it was like comparable to a modern police force, but it was at the same time a massive bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. Because they had something like 60 different courts in charge of different aspects of life in Florence. So they had a court in charge of salt. They had a court in charge of prostitution, sex work, which was legal, but it was strictly run by the wonderfully named Office of Decency. So there was all these different courts and mechanisms to control how life was done in the city. There was I think one court per 1,000 people who lived in Florence at the time. So it was a case of figuring out those elements of it, and then a ton of research into the period and into how life the most interesting books for me were actually the sort of the basic books of how life worked, what normal life was like. And those are often the hardest ones to find, whereas big academic texts or stories that tell you about the superstructure of history are fine. Mm-hmm. And there's no shortage of books about artists and architecture. But if you want to find out how a normal person called, Roberto, whatever, Clemenza, then trying to find out what his day was like was actually an awful lot harder. So that took the longest time. And then the character of Cesare Aldo, I knew he was going to have, I thought he would be a captain, and I discovered they didn't really have captains, so he would be an officer. And then it was developing him as a character, giving him a credible backstory that would enable him to be able to move through sort of all the levels of Florentine society, from the lowliest slave and servant up to, be able to mingle with dukes and merchant bankers and everybody in between. So it was building a character and then finding a shape for the story. And there's this one moment in history, this one event in history, which sort of is a tipping point in the development of Renaissance Florence and how it was governed through the 16th century. So that's the tipping point. That's the key moment in the story that became the fulcrum of City of Vengeance.
Excellent. And that's out on the 4th of February, is that right?
Yes. So, 4th of February from Pan Macmillan in hardback and audiobook and ebook, inevitably. And I think out in paperback next January. And then book 2, the plan is for that to come out in February 2022. As yet untitled. The working titles so far have been Nuns, Blood and Consequences. Or for the Agatha Christie fans, And Then There Were Nuns.
I'm assuming it has something to do with nuns then, Stu.
I don't know what you're basing that on. That's wild supposition. Yes, strangely. No, the book 2 is set in a convent, and it's sort of the idea that came with just a single image, which was a nun opening a door in the convent and discovering a dead, naked man's body, punctured with dozens of stab wounds and with covered in blood. And I was like, oh, that's good. What's he doing there? Why is he? Who killed him? How? And why is he naked? So it's sort of like first thing on a Monday morning, they open the scriptorium to start setting up the scriptorium to illuminate some manuscripts, and there's a dead naked guy covered in blood on the floor of the scriptorium, and we're off to the races.
Excellent.
That sounds excellent, yeah.
And en route to this being published, I just wanted to ask you about the Pitch Perfect competition at Bloody Scotland. So I think you won this Pitch Perfect competition at Bloody Scotland. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who don't know, Bloody Scotland is Scotland's international crime fiction festival. It's been running since, I think, 2012. And each year they have a contest called Pitch Perfect, where they have a panel of agents and editors and publishers from sort of the crime fiction publishing scene come up to, it's Stirling in Scotland is where the festival is held. And they hear pitches from 3 minutes of pitches from writers. And so what happens is each year, Bloody Scotland invites people who have got a crime project they're trying to, interest editors or agents or publishers in to apply for Pitch Perfect. You have to write a 100-word summary of your project, and you submit that. And then they select from that. So each year there's anywhere between 50 and 100 people apply. 8 people are chosen. And then they have, over the course of an hour at the Bloody Scotland Festival, each person will stand up. You have 3 minutes to pitch your project to not just the panel, but to a room full of fee-paying audience members. And then you have your 3 minutes, you sit down, the panel gives you snap feedback instantly. And then after all 8 people have done their pitches and had their feedback, the panel retire to another room to consider their verdict. White smoke emerges like hope. And then they come back in and they say, we think this person gave the best pitch. Sometimes they do a highly commended as well. And actually all the people who have won Pitch Perfect over the 8-9 years that it's been running now have all gone on to get literary agents representing them. Quite a few of the people who've been highly commended have done that as well. And an awful lot of the people who have done Pitch Perfect have then, their novels have been published. Some of them have been bestsellers. So Sirens by Joseph Knox, The Tattoo Thief, Alison Belsham, they both won Pitch Perfect, and their books have been bestsellers either in the UK or other territories. So I did Pitch Perfect with City of Vengeance, although I think it had a different working title at the time. I have a I'm terrible at writing titles, inventing titles for my books. They always get renamed because people go, no, we're not calling it that. That'd be ridiculous. It happens all the time. And so it was with City of Vengeance. It had another name. So I stood up and I pitched City of Vengeance to the panel, the longest 3 minutes of my life. But boy, had I practiced. I mean, my pitch was pretty slick, I think. So I pitched, and then everybody else on the panel pitched. We all pitched that year. And then Daniel Culver, who was the last person to pitch, he stood up, he gave his pitch, and I went, he's won. That's a great pitch. His pitch was just primo. Mm-hmm. And then the panel went out, at which point I just relaxed because I thought, well, there's no chance I'm winning because Daniel's was just amazing. So, and then the panel came back in and announced that I had won. Ironically, I actually pitched under a pseudonym because I know some of the organisers of Bloody Scotland, I didn't want to be chosen. I didn't want there to be any chance of me being chosen because they knew me.
Yeah.
I wanted to be chosen because of the quality of the project I was pitching. So none of the people on the panel knew me except Jenny Brown, who was the chair of the panel. So actually when they announced who had won, they said the winner was Charles, because my pen name for the pitch was Charles Otto Vollmer, which was my granddad's name. So I was like, oh, he's Charles. And then I went, oh, it's me. Oh, slightly fluffed the moment, but there it was. Anyway, so I won Pitch Perfect, which was great. I hadn't even finished the book at that point. I think I was 70,000 words in, but it was a real sort of boost to the confidence. And I finished 7 weeks later. I finished the first draft, and then several more drafts. And then I was querying agents in spring 2019. And then Jenny Brown became my agent, offered me representation. I was very happy to have Jenny as my agent because she's amazing and wonderful. And then it went out on submission to various editors. And we ended up with Pan Macmillan. We had several publishers actually made offers on it, but Pan Macmillan, I mean, I love Pan long before they became my publisher, because I grew up reading sort of Ian Fleming, who was published by Pan, and Colin Dexter's and Spectre Morse, all published by Pan, and Anne Cleves and C.J. Sampson for the historical crime readers is like the god. So to be published by Pan Macmillan, who published these amazing authors, I was like, oh. So that was a dream come true. So that was announced September 2019, and now the book's finally coming out in February 2021 in the midst of another lockdown.
Well, yeah, that was what I was going to ask you about. I mean, obviously, it's a moment when lots of authors get excited about the launch of the book, and this is a book you've been working on for so long, and then for it to happen now. We've spoken to, obviously, a lot of our guests have been through the same thing in the past year, but does that take anything out of it at all for you, or is it just something different that you just have to cope with?
Well, I think it's the same for all authors who've had books. I mean, I've got a lot of friends who've had debuts out in the last year. Nell Patterson, who writes for Avon, her book, I'm drawing a complete blank on what's the first one called? Silent House. The Silent House. That came out in, I think, March or April last year, just as lockdown was hitting. And then her second book, which was Silent Night, came out November last year when there was another lockdown. And then her third, which is The Silent Suspects, coming out in April. Hoping we'll be out of lockdown by then. But honestly, she's got to the point now where she's convinced that, whenever she has a book coming out, there'll be another lockdown. But
it's her fault.
I think she actually did I think her first book, they managed to have one actual live people in a room launch event for her first book, and then everything was locked down after that. So I mean, you would love to have the big launch at Waterstones or somewhere else in a big city and have 100 people turn up and them all queue up physically and you sign the book and say hello and all your friends and people who know you come along. That would be lovely, but it's not going to happen. And that's just the way things are right now. And God knows there's an awful lot of people got a lot worse than writers whining about not having a physical launch. So I have no sympathy for me on that. It would be nice, and there will be other books. So hopefully by the time Aldo 2, Medici Boogaloo, or whatever it ends up being called, is unleashed next year, then we will all be vaccinated and be able to, meet people for real. But it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. So I have a virtual launch on the night of publication. There's 3 independent publishers in Scotland. Independent bookshops in Scotland, Far From the Madding Crowd, the Edinburgh Bookshop, and Atkinson Price have joined together and formed a collective. And so they've hosted some amazing events over the last year online. So we're doing a digital launch with them. And my editor, Alex, is going to be asking me questions for that. So that'll be great.
Great.
And looking forward, obviously you've got the sequels coming out, you're planning them and stuff, but would you ever think about going back to screenplays or back to comics, or are you kind of firmly in the world of novels for the moment?
Well, certainly, I I can't see myself going back to screenwriting. Well, for a start, I don't have a screenwriting agent anymore, because when I stopped screenwriting, my agent very sensibly said, I was like, yeah, it's time. Thanks. She was lovely. I mean, her name was Katie Williams. She's at the agency. She's a brilliant agent. But it's sort of like I wasn't getting anywhere and I wasn't doing any screenwriting. So she was like, I was like, yeah, you're fine. Don't worry. So I probably can't see myself going back to screenwriting. I mean, if somebody felt the urge to option City of Vengeance, God help them, and turn it into a film or a TV series, which anything is theoretically possible, but I can't see it happening because it would cost an absolute fortune.
Yeah.
Then yeah, I'm sure I would make sure in the contract that they would be required to pay me for a first draft, because I'd love to have a crack at it. But no, I think screenwriting is probably more likely in my past than my future. Comics, I'm still writing. I write for Egmont, Sweden, which is a publisher in Scandinavia. So I write issues of the Phantom comic for them. The Phantom is like a costumed hero who's been going longer than Superman. He's been around since the mid-30s. So
Purple.
I write for that, although the only place it's published in English is Australia, ironically. Because the Phantom is more popular in Australia than Batman or the X-Men or Spider-Man.
Oh,
It's
really?
the most popular comics character in Australia.
Is this
And
the
similarly
same?
in Scandinavia? It's huge.
Is it the
Oh.
same Phantom, as in he was a part of a group Defenders of something, Purple and all that sort
with
of stuff?
Mandrake the Magician.
Yes,
Yes,
exactly. Yeah.
It started it was a newspaper adventure strip invented by a guy called Lee Falk, who also invented Mandrake the Magician and a bunch of other things. And and then it was a film in the 90s when every comic in the world was being turned into a terrible film in the mid-90s. There was a Phantom film starring Billy Zane, and it's got Catherine Zeta-Jones in it.
Yeah.
And the tagline was "Slam Evil," which is
I don't even know what that means.
exactly. It's surely one of the worst taglines ever. It's not the best film. Let's just leave it at that. It's not the worst film, but it's not the best film either. So I write for the Phantom. And the other project I've been slowly shepherding forward is I have written and co-created an original graphic novel called Danny's Toys with a Northern Irish artist called Rory Coleman. And so we've been working on that for off and on for 2 or 3 years now. So I am hoping my plan is to do it as a Kickstarter, probably in the spring. So I will do a Kickstarter of that, and then we'll be able to publish it and people will be able to read it. So it's Danny's Toys actually started as a screenplay. It was a short film I wrote when I was a screenwriting student, and which the screenplay won prizes in LA and it won a prize here in Scotland. But it got close to being made a couple of times, but it never quite managed. They couldn't get the financing together, and then it just sort of interest in it fell away. And eventually, it's a story I love, so it's a total passion project, which is proven by the fact that I've been carrying it around for like over a decade. But the passion projects are often the ones that sort of connect to people the most, if you can just find a way of getting them published.
Yeah.
So I've turned my original screenplay into an original graphic novel, working with Rory, and we're going to hopefully publish that April, May. We shall see.
Yeah, the Kickstarter is the way to go with comics, it would seem. There's a lot of successful comics Kickstarters now. So
No, absolutely. So I've been doing a ton of research into how to do Kickstarter, how to do it properly, and how to do it well and make a complete horlicks of it. So I've been gradually building up my knowledge. I've also been supporting a lot of other people's Kickstarter comics projects on the basis that, when the time comes, I can smile sweetly at them and go, well...
Shipping costs. That's what to bear in mind with Kickstarter.
That's my worry. And also with Brexit, having made shipping to the EU very complicated at the moment, I suspect I will probably do a book. I won't ship it into the EU, although I wouldn't expect to have shipped many to the EU anyway. But I would want to make it available to North American audiences, so I'm going to have to be very savvy about shipping costs, because I know it can be hideously expensive to just ship a book to America. It's like double the price of the book, which just seems mad.
Yeah, exactly. And yet
That's
some people
that's
will
what
buy it.
PDFs are for. You know, if
Yeah,
somebody wants to
exactly.
read it,
Yeah.
they can pay and get the PDF version, and that's fine. It's a story I love, and I love the characters, and Rory's done amazing artwork. Alex Hassan has done the coloring, Haas has done the lettering. It's all amazing. And I've got this great selection of pinups at the back of the book with some amazing artists that done pinups for it, like Duncan Fegredo and Frank Quietly,
Brilliant.
and a bunch of other artists. So I really want to get it into people's hands. I just want people to be able to read it, and so that's it. It's the writing thing. You write because you've got a story you want to tell and you want to share it with people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant.
What was the last book that you read?
The last book I read was Edge of the Grave by Robbie Morrison, which I read an advance proof of it. It's coming out the 4th of March. It's been published also by Pan Macmillan. And Robbie, for those people who know their British comics, he's the creator or co-creator of Nikolai Dante, which is a hugely popular character in the pages of 2000 AD. And he's written for a load of American comic books like Batman and The Authority and a bunch of others. And so he's written his first novel, which is set in 1932 Glasgow, and that's a police procedural. It's sort of getting described as Peaky Blinders meets The Untouchables in Glasgow.
Oh, cool.
Nice, good pitch.
And I've read it. It's hardcore. I will definitely say that for it. If you're squeamish, but it's a really good story. It's really funny, a lot of dark humor, which is so Robbie. And yeah, that's the first in a series, and that's getting some amazing author quotes at the moment because it's really good. So I can hardly recommend that. So yeah, that's the last book I read, Edge of the Grave, Robbie Morrison, out in March 2021.
Great.
Nice. And what about the last film that you watched?
Oh, well, at the cinema or just like Netflix?
Yeah, it would be hard to remember the last one I saw at the cinema.
It was. I can't remember the last film I saw in the cinema. It's too long ago now. The last film I watched. Oh, I got into a bad habit of watching half a film on Netflix or Prime and never quite getting to the finish of it. So I'm struggling to remember what the last film I did watch was.
Even
I'm watching more TV. I'm watching Call My Agent on Netflix, which is like a French series set in a film agent office, which is hilarious. And then Star Trek Lower Decks, which is a cartoon set in the Star Trek universe, which is gut-bustingly funny.
Oh, I've not started watching that yet. That's on my list to watch. So
it's great. You're going to love it.
Yeah.
You're absolutely going to love it. It's really funny. And the episodes are really short. They're only like 25 minutes, so that you're on a winner.
Yeah, it's quite nice to have a little short show.
I'm trying to spread them out because I don't want to run out of the good stuff. So I think actually the last film I did finish was called The 40-Year-Old Version, Version, which is a black and white film. And it's about a woman who was she was like an award-winning playwright, but now she's just turned 40, and basically all she can do is teach, and she can't get her plays on. So she starts rapping. So she becomes sort of like a latter-day rapper. And yeah, it's really good. It's really well observed. I wouldn't be surprised if it's up for an Oscar or two, actually, if they have the Oscars this year.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah, the 40-year-old version. We did finish that. I remember that. So yes, that's a good one.
Excellent. And well, you've answered the other question we have, which is the last TV show. So Tarek, you go into the last bit.
Yes, the very last thing we do is a quick fire either or. The first one is we'll go for a film one, Dredd or Judge Dredd.
Dredd. Please.
No hesitation.
Oh, please.
Hilary Mantel or CJ Sansom.
Oh. I mean, they're almost as long as each other now, the books. CJ Samson.
Okay.
That was tough.
TV or cinema?
TV.
Nice.
Fancy restaurant or takeaway?
Fancy restaurant, actually, if only for the fact I haven't been in one for so long.
Yeah, exactly.
And the last one, audiobook or ebook?
At the moment, I would say ebook, but only because I'm not going anywhere. Whereas when I was driving back and forth, because I live outside Edinburgh and I had to drive into Edinburgh and back, so it was an hour each way. And I was doing that 4 days a week. So I would get through a lot of podcasts and some audio books. So it used to be, I would have said audio, but these days I'll say ebook.
Nice.
Excellent. That you, just for your information, that used to be real book, ebook, but it was always nearly chosen as real book. So we changed it because Tarek was very disappointed.
There's a lot of weirdos out there who go on about smelling books. Which I don't
Yeah. Well, I must admit, I have sniffed City of Vengeance. It's a new book smell and it's mine.
Exactly. Well, I really enjoyed that chat with David, and I thought it was really interesting what he was saying about when you're writing, not just historical fiction, any fiction really, that a lot of writers can sort of forget to use all five senses when they're writing it. They'll tell you what you're seeing, what people are feeling, what they're hearing, but the smell is often forgotten in these things, or the taste of something,
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's, I don't know why. I don't know if it's just the kind of default view of the imagination is just to go for what something looks like or sounds like. But yeah, it's so true that's definitely the taste and the smell, or the two senses, which I think are definitely left behind a lot. And I think that's a great tip for writers to hone in on. Yeah,
because it can really take you into a scene. You can suddenly really be dragged into it if you suddenly think, oh, it smells like this, or the food tastes
and there's a little
like
small thing, a small line about it,
exactly.
can really elevate the whole section, or the paragraph, or whatever. For sure.
Well, City of Vengeance is now out. We recorded that just before it was out, but it is now out. So if you're into your historical thrillers, I would definitely recommend picking it up. I have read it, and it was really good fun. And as I said at the start, very fast paced. So go and grab a copy now. So thanks very much to David for coming on to the podcast. And actually, next week's guest also has a historical fiction
That's
link.
right, she does. We're chatting with Miranda Mallins next week, whose debut novel, The Puritan Princess, is out, and it's a historical thriller again, in a different vein.
But a different vein, obviously set in England. It's all about Cromwell's daughter. But Miranda has studied Cromwell in detail. She's brought that historical knowledge into the writing of the book. And again, like David, actually, it's interesting. She felt that she wanted to be really loyal to the history as written, because you do read historical fiction where it'll put you in a place and time, and there'll be certain events that happen, but then other events, the writers aren't so fussed about whether it's actually historically accurate or not. Certainly, David and Miranda next week, we're of the school that you should be as accurate as possible when you're telling these stories.
I think that's right. And it's she picked an interesting time span for her book, which is a kind of in between the King Charles I and the II, when Cromwell was in charge. And it's actually quite an exciting part of history, I suppose, in the sense that there was a lot of upheaval. Kind of the rulers were changing, all the politics of the day, etc. So it's I mean, that's a prime setting for any kind of story, I think, when you've got all that background to run against. Yeah,
and we chat to her about all of that next week. So please do tune in for that one. But before we go this week, if you enjoyed the episode, please do take the time to leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever your favourite podcast app is. That would really help us stay high in the rankings. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.